In the spring of the year 1186, in a small stone manor house on a hill in the county of Champagne, a young man of 22 years stood in the courtyard at first light and watched the servants strap his belongings to the back of a brown packhorse. His name was Hugues, son of Renaud, and he was a knight of the order of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the temple of Solomon, which men in the kingdoms of the West had taken to calling, more simply, the Templars. He was leaving for the Holy Land. He did not yet know that within 15 months he would be one of perhaps 100 men out of an army of 20,000 to walk away alive from the worst defeat the Christian kingdoms of the East would ever suffer. The morning was cold for May. There was still frost on the grass in the courtyard, and the breath of the horses came out white in the pale air. Hugues stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the work, and tried not to look at the door of the manor house, where his mother was, because his mother had told him the night before that she would not come down to see him off, and that she had said her goodbyes already, and that he was not to look for her in the courtyard or at the windows. He had agreed to this because she had asked him to, and because he understood, in the way that a young man can sometimes understand a thing without yet knowing what it means, that for her to watch him ride away would have been more than she could bear. His father had been dead for 11 years. There were no brothers. There was a younger sister named Aline, who was 15, and who was at that moment standing in the doorway of the kitchen, wrapped in a grey woolen cloak, watching her brother with eyes that had been red since the previous afternoon, and that were red again now. Hugues went over to her. He took her face in both his hands, and he kissed her on the forehead, and he said, "I will come back." "You will not," she said. He did not answer. He kissed her again on the top of her dark head, and he turned and went to the horse. He swung up into the saddle. He took up the reins. He looked once around the courtyard, at the stone walls and the apple trees and the small chapel his grandfather had built, and he understood with absolute clarity that his sister was right, and that he would never see any of it again. Then he turned the horse, and he rode out under the gatehouse, and he did not look back. He was 3 days' ride from Marseille. He arrived on the evening of the 4th day, having slept twice in roadside inns, and once in a barn, and he found at the harbour the great galley that the Templar commandery had hired to take him, and 70 other young brothers down the long blue length of the Mediterranean to the kingdom of Jerusalem. The galley was called the Holy Sepulchre. It had 2 banks of oars and a single great square sail with a black cross painted on it, and Hugues looked at it from the quay in the dusk and felt a thing in his chest that he could not have named, a thing that was part fear and part exultation and part something else, older and deeper, that had to do with the small chapel in his grandfather's courtyard and with the long line of his ancestors who had carried swords for one cause or another, and whose tombs were in the floor of the church at the bottom of the hill at home. He was a Templar. He had taken the vows the year before, in the great chapter house at Paris, on a winter morning, with snow falling outside the high windows and the candles burning yellow in the cold, dim air. He had renounced all property. He had renounced the prospect of marriage. He had sworn obedience unto death to the master of the order, and through him to the Pope, and through the Pope to God. He had been given his white mantle with the red cross sewn upon the left breast, and he had been told, by an older knight whose name he had never afterwards remembered, that the white was for purity, and the red was for the blood he was now expected to be willing to shed in defense of the holy places. He had taken these things in silence. He had been 21 years old. He had wept a little, after, in his cell in the dormitory, but he had wept quietly so that the other novices on either side of him would not hear. Now, on the quay at Marseille, he led his horse up the wooden ramp onto the deck of the galley, and he gave it over to the grooms, and he went and stood at the rail and watched the harbour fall away as the rowers pulled the galley out into the open water. The sun was setting. The cliffs of the southern coast went red and then purple and then black behind them. Hugues stood at the rail until the last lights of Marseille had disappeared into the haze of the sea behind, and then he went below, and he ate a hard biscuit and a piece of cheese, and he lay down in his hammock with the other knights, and he listened to the slow creak of the timbers and the steady wash of the water on the hull, and after a long time he slept. The voyage was 8 weeks. They put in at Genoa and at Palermo, and at the great fortified harbour of Limassol on Cyprus. Hugues was sick for the first 10 days, vomiting over the rail in the grey mornings, and he was ashamed of this. But the older knights laughed at him kindly and told him that they had all been the same on their first voyage, and that the sickness would pass. It passed. By the 3rd week he could eat again. By the 5th week he had taken his place at the bench with the other knights, and was helping with the rowing, when the wind died, and his hands were ringed with broken blisters, and his shoulders ached with a clean honest ache that he had not known since his boyhood working in the fields with his father's tenants. The sun was bright on the water. The world went past in a long blue dream of islands and headlands and small white towns clinging to the rocks, and Hugues, who had never in his life been more than 100 miles from the manor where he had been born, watched it all from the rail and thought that whatever else came of his journey, he had at least seen these things, and that this was a thing that no man could take from him. They sighted the coast of the Holy Land on the morning of the 8th week. It was a low brown line under a hard, pale sky, with white cliffs to the north and pale yellow beaches stretching south, and Hugues looked at it and felt the strange recognition of a place he had been carrying all his life in the songs his mother had sung him as a boy. This was the country where Christ had walked. These were the cliffs that the prophets had walked along. The dust on the wind that came out across the water to meet the galley as it turned in toward the harbour at Acre was the dust of the holy places, and Hugues had carried this country in his heart for so long, without ever having seen it, that the simple fact of the brown line on the horizon brought tears to his eyes that he turned his face into his shoulder to hide. They came into the harbour at Acre at midday. Acre was the great port of the kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a walled city of perhaps 30,000 people, on a long curving bay, with a great mole running out into the sea and a chain that could be drawn across the harbour mouth to keep out an enemy fleet. The walls were of pale yellow stone. The towers were tall. The flag of the kingdom of Jerusalem, a white field with a great red cross and 4 small red crosses in the quarters, flew from the highest of them. Other flags flew from other towers. The flags of the Italian merchant communes who had their quarters in the city. The flags of the great military orders. And above the citadel of the Templars themselves, the black and white banner of the order, the Beauseant, 2 halves of a single field, black above and white below, which Hugues had seen carried in chapter houses in France, but which he had not, until that moment, ever seen flying over a real fortress in the country it had been made for. He looked up at it as the galley came into the harbour, and he thought, I am here. I am where I was meant to be. Whatever happens to me now, I will have been here. He disembarked with the other knights. He gave over his belongings to the brothers of the commandery. He was assigned a cell in the dormitory and a place at the long table in the refectory. And that night he ate his first meal in the Holy Land, bread and lamb and dates, and a thin red wine. And he prayed in the chapel afterwards, on his knees on the cold tile floor, and he gave thanks for a long time with his face in his hands. The kingdom into which Hugues had come was a kingdom in slow and visible decline. It had been founded 88 years before by the soldiers of the First Crusade, who had taken Jerusalem in a great storming in the summer of 1099. For a long time after that the kingdom had prospered. It had stretched from the Egyptian frontier in the south to the borders of Antioch in the north. Its kings had ruled in Jerusalem itself, in the great stone palace beside the Temple Mount where Solomon's temple had once stood. But the kingdom had always been small, and the lands of Islam that surrounded it had always been very large. And for the past 20 years, the lands of Islam had been gathering themselves under a single ruler, in a way they had not done in the lifetime of any man living. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, called Salah ad-Din Saladin. He was a Kurd, born in northern Iraq, who had risen through the service of the rulers of Egypt and Syria, and who had at last, by patience and by war, made himself the master of both. He held Cairo and Damascus. He held Aleppo. He held Marseille. He held all the country to the east and to the south and to the north of the kingdom of Jerusalem, and he had said in public and many times that he would have Jerusalem itself before he died. The kingdom in 1186 had a king, but the king was a child. His name was Baldwin V. He was 9 years old. He was the nephew of the previous king, Baldwin Roman IV, who had died of leprosy at 24 after a reign of 11 extraordinary years, in which a young man slowly rotting from his own disease had defended his kingdom with a courage that made even his enemies speak of him with awe. The leper king had named the boy as his heir because there was no other male heir. The boy was sickly. Hugues had been in Acre for 6 weeks when the news came that the boy too was dead. The kingdom now had no king at all. What followed, in that summer and autumn of 1186, was a struggle for the throne between two factions that hated each other more than either of them hated the Saracens. On one side stood the boy king's mother, Sibylla, and her husband Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman who had come east some years before to make his fortune. On the other stood Raymond Roman III, Count of Tripoli, who was the most experienced soldier in the kingdom, and whom many of the barons believed should have been regent. Sibylla and Guy moved first. They had themselves crowned in Jerusalem in September, in a hasty ceremony that the patriarch agreed to officiate. Raymond refused to recognize them. He withdrew to his own city of Tiberias, on the Sea of Galilee, and he opened secret negotiations with Saladin for protection. The kingdom, on the eve of the worst threat it had ever faced, was openly divided in two. Hugues, in his cell in the Templar commandery in Acre, heard these things spoken of in the refectory in the evenings. He listened, and he understood very little of them. He was a young man from Champagne. The politics of the high kingdoms of the East were a foreign country to him. He kept his vows. He prayed at the offices. He drilled in the courtyard with the other knights, the long Templar lances on horseback, the practice with the sword, the slow, heavy march of the foot drill. He learned the names of his brothers. There was a Norman knight named Geoffroy, perhaps 30 years old, with a thin, scarred face and eyes that did not quite ever meet the eyes of another man, who took Hugues under his wing in a quiet, undeclared way, and taught him 100 small, useful things. How to oil mail in the dry desert air without breaking the leather thongs that held it, how to keep his sword from rusting in the salt wind off the sea, how to ride a tall destrier in the heat without killing the horse. There was a German knight named Wilhelm, very tall and slow-spoken, who slept in the cell next to Hugues, and who, on most nights, prayed aloud in his own language for an hour after the rest of them had gone to bed, in a low murmur that Hugues found he came to listen for and to be comforted by. The new year came. The winter passed. In the spring of 1187, Saladin moved. He moved slowly at first, a small raid here, a larger one there. Then, in late April, his nephew Alafdal led a mounted force of 7,000 men across the upper Jordan and into the kingdom of Jerusalem, and he marched south through the country of Galilee toward the springs at a place called the Crescent. There were some Templars at a small castle nearby, perhaps 130 knights and brothers and squires, and the master of the Templars, a man named Gerard de Ridefort, decided to attack. Hugues was there. He had been sent up to the castle 6 weeks before, with 20 other knights, to reinforce the small garrison. On the morning of the 1st of May, in the year 1187, he rode out at dawn with the other Templars, and with a small contingent of Hospitallers who had joined them, and they went down the road through the green spring country to meet the Saracen force at the springs. It was a disaster. The Saracen force was nearly 50 times larger than the Christian one. The master of the Templars knew this. He attacked anyway. Hugues never afterwards understood why. Some men said the master was a fool. Some said he was vain and could not bear the thought of declining battle. Some said that he had quarreled with Raymond of Tripoli and wanted to prove that a small Templar force could do what Raymond's larger one had not. Hugues did not know. He only knew, on the morning of the 1st of May, the small thunder of his own horse's hooves on the spring grass, the long line of his brother knights on either side of him with their lances down, and then the sudden astonishing wall of Saracen horsemen that rose up from the slope ahead of them like the sea coming over a wall. The Templar charge went into them. Hugues felt his lance take a man in the chest and break. He drew his sword. There was a great noise all around him, a wave of noise he could not have separated into its parts. He cut at a man and missed, and cut at another and connected, and went on. He saw, off to his right, Geoffroy, his quiet Norman friend, ride into a knot of Saracen riders, and disappear into them as a stone disappears into deep water. He did not see him come out. He saw, to his left, the white surcoats of his brothers go down one by one as the Saracens enveloped the small force from both sides and closed around it. He saw the horse of the knight beside him shot through the chest by an arrow and fall, and the knight roll clear of it and stand and fight on foot. And he saw that knight too go down, with 3 arrows in him. The master of the Templars escaped. He rode out of the back of the engagement with 3 other men, and he made it to the safety of a nearby castle, and he lived. Of the 130 Templars and Hospitallers who had ridden down to the springs that morning, he and those 3 were the only ones to come out alive. The rest were dead in the spring grass. Hugues was not. He had been knocked from his horse by the impact of a spear that had not pierced his mail, but had thrown him sideways out of the saddle, and he had lain stunned at the foot of an old olive tree as the battle moved past him. He had come to his senses in the dust, with his face against the warm spring grass, and he had heard the Saracens moving among the bodies, finishing the wounded and stripping the dead. He had lain very still. He had been bleeding from a cut at his temple that he had not noticed taking. The blood had run down his face and into the grass, and he must have looked, to a passing horseman, as if his head had been opened. He was not seen. When the Saracens had ridden away, they were in haste, because they were a raiding force, and they wanted to be back across the Jordan before any Christian relief column could find them. Hugues lay still for another hour. Then he sat up. He looked around. He saw the bodies of his brothers in the long grass. He saw, perhaps 30 paces from him, the white surcoat of Geoffroy with 3 arrows in the back, lying on his side with one arm outstretched as if he had been reaching for something. Hugues went to him on his hands and knees because he did not yet trust his legs, and he closed Geoffroy's eyes, and he sat for a long time beside the body and did not weep. Then he stood up. He walked the 4 miles back to the castle. He arrived at sundown. The master of the Templars looked at him as he came through the gate, and the master's face did not change, and the master did not say anything to him. Hugues was given water, and his cut was bound, and he was sent to his bed. In the days that followed, the Templar master sent word to Acre and to Jerusalem and to all the great lords of the kingdom. The full strength of Islam was in the field. Saladin himself was crossing the Jordan with the main army, said to be 20,000 horse, and as many foot. The kingdom must muster all its men, and it must muster them at once. The young King Guy gave the order. Even Raymond of Tripoli, swallowing his hatred of Guy, came in with his men, because the kingdom that he had refused to defend for Guy he would defend for Christ. The whole army of the kingdom of Jerusalem mustered at the springs of Saphuria in late June 1187. There were perhaps 1,200 mounted knights, and as many sergeants on horseback, and 12,000 foot, and there had not been an army that size in the kingdom in living memory. Hugues was among them. The Templar contingent was 400 knights, nearly the whole strength of the order in the east, and Hugues, who had been at Cresson and survived, was given a place near the master at the head of the column. On the 3rd of July, in the year 1187, on a hot Friday morning, the army of the kingdom of Jerusalem broke camp at the springs of Saphuria and marched east, into the dry country toward Tiberias, where Saladin had laid siege to Raymond's wife in the citadel. Saladin had lured them. He had taken Tiberias precisely because he knew the king would come to relieve it. He had made Raymond's own wife the bait, and Raymond himself, that morning at the council of war, had begged the king not to come, had said that the country between Saphuria and Tiberias was waterless, and that to march an army across it in July was to deliver them into Saladin's hands. The king had agreed at first. Then the master of the Templars had spoken privately with the king in his tent, in the small hours, and had said that to refuse battle was a mark of cowardice on the order and on the kingdom. And at dawn, the king had reversed his decision, and he had given the order to march. They marched out at sunrise. The country between Saphuria and Tiberias is a high, dry plateau. There are no rivers and few wells, and in July the grass is dead and brown. The sun rises early there, and it rises hot. The army of the kingdom of Jerusalem began to suffer almost at once. By mid-morning the foot soldiers were stumbling. By noon, men were beginning to fall out of the line of march and lie down in the brown grass and refuse to go on. The water that the army carried in skins on the backs of donkeys was too little, and the donkeys were dying. Saladin's light cavalry, Turkmen horse archers, hundreds of them, appeared at the edges of the column and began to ride along its flanks, shooting arrows at long range and riding off before the heavy knights could catch them. Men in the column began to fall, with arrows in them. The march slowed. The march slowed further. Hugues, in the white surcoat of the Templars, with his great helm strapped to the cantle of his saddle, and the sun beating directly down on the iron of his mail, rode in the rearguard with the master and 400 of his brothers. The dust that came up off the column ahead of them was fine and white, and got into everything, into his eyes, into his throat, into the joints of his mail, where the sweat had soaked him through. The Saracen horse archers came at the rearguard most of all, because the rearguard was the hardest part of the column to protect, and the Templars, in their heavy mail and on their tall destriers, could not catch them. The arrows came in steady waves. Hugues saw a brother to his left take an arrow in the eye and slump in his saddle, and ride on for a little while as a dead man before he fell. He saw another take one in the throat. He saw the squires going forward into the dust to bring back the wounded, and he saw some of the squires not come back. By late afternoon, the army had covered perhaps 8 miles. It had been meant to cover 16. The water was nearly gone. The heat had not broken. And in front of them, on a low brown ridge in the haze of the afternoon, between them and the green country of the Sea of Galilee, where there was water and life, stood the entire army of Saladin in line of battle. The king halted the column. There was no time to reach the lake before sundown. There was nowhere to go. Saladin held the high ground in front of them, and his light horse was in their rear. There was only one place on the plateau with any water at all, a small foul spring at a place called the Horns of Hattin, named for 2 low hills above it that rose like the horns of a beast, and the spring had already been taken by Saladin's men, and they were sitting on it, waiting. The army of the kingdom of Jerusalem stopped where it was. It made camp on the dry plateau without water. The night came down. The men, dying of thirst, lay on the dust and could not sleep. They could hear the Saracens singing in their lines, perhaps a mile off in the dark, the high, strange singing of victory before the fact. Saladin's men, who had come up that day from the lake, had water enough for an army twice their size. They poured it on the ground in front of the Christian sentries, in the dark, to taunt them. Hugues did not sleep that night. He sat with his back against a pile of saddles, and his brothers Wilhelm and another knight named Pierre sat on either side of him, and they did not speak. Wilhelm prayed in his own language for an hour. Then he stopped. The stars came up. The wind off the dry country was hot and tasted of dust. Toward dawn, the Saracens fired the dry grass on the slope below the camp, so that the smoke would blow into the eyes of the Christian army when the sun came up. The smoke came. Hugues, with his face in his cloak to keep the smoke out of his lungs, understood that he was going to die that day. He thought of his sister Aline in the doorway of the kitchen, on the morning he had ridden out of his mother's courtyard. He thought of his mother, who had not come down to see him off. He thought of the small chapel his grandfather had built. He thought, briefly, and without meaning to, of a girl from a neighboring village whom he had once kissed in a hayloft when he had been 17, and whom he had not thought of in 5 years, and whose face came to him very clearly now in the smoke and the dark. He found that he did not mind dying very much. He found, to his own surprise, that what he minded was that no one in his family would ever know what had happened to him. They would only know that he had not come back. The sun rose into the smoke. The Battle of the Horns of Hattin was fought on the 4th of July, in the year of our Lord 1187. It was a Saturday. It was very hot. The army of the kingdom of Jerusalem, blinded by smoke and mad with thirst, tried at first to break out toward the lake. The foot soldiers, in their tens of thousands, simply broke and ran for the slope of the northern horn, where they imagined they could see water in the distance. They were cut down there in great numbers, or surrounded and forced to surrender. The mounted knights, heavy cavalry, the only remaining force of the kingdom, made several charges down the slope in an attempt to break the Saracen line. Each time they were turned back. Each time fewer of them came back than had gone forward. Hugues was in the third charge. He rode down the slope with the Templars in a long, even line, his lance under his arm, and he picked a Saracen horseman in the line ahead of him, and he set his eyes on the man and did not look at anything else. And the man's face, very young and very dark, with a small black beard and an open shouting mouth, came toward him in the dust. Hugues took him in the chest with the lance. The lance broke. He drew his sword. He went on. He did not remember very much of the rest of it. He remembered swinging the sword. He remembered the way his arm grew slowly heavier as the morning wore on, and the way his breath came in short heart rags that seemed to scrape the inside of his throat. He remembered Wilhelm beside him, the great calm German, taking a sword cut across the neck that opened him to the spine, and the way Wilhelm's eyes had gone surprised, and then quiet, and then nothing at all, in the space of perhaps 2 long breaths. He remembered Pierre going down with a horse on top of him. He remembered the Saracen lines pressing in from all sides slowly, like a hand closing around a small bird. By midday it was over. The Templar contingent had been reduced from 400 to perhaps 100. The king himself had been taken prisoner. The true cross, the great relic that the bishops carried at the head of the army, said to be a fragment of the cross of the crucifixion itself, the holiest thing the kingdom of Jerusalem possessed, had been captured. Raymond of Tripoli, alone of the great lords, had broken out with a small band of horsemen at the very beginning of the battle, and ridden clear, and had reached Tripoli days later with his life, and almost nothing else, and had died there a few months after of grief or shame or both. The rest of the army of Jerusalem was dead, or wounded, or in chains. The kingdom that had stood for 88 years in the Holy Land had ceased to exist as a fighting force in the space of a single July afternoon. Hugues did not die. He had been wounded. In the last hour, a Saracen mace had caught him on the side of the helmet and knocked him from his horse, and a sword cut had opened his right thigh where the male skirts had ridden up, and he had crawled, half blind, into a small hollow in the ground beside a dead horse, and he had passed out. He came to in late afternoon, with the heat going out of the sun and the carrion birds already beginning to circle, and he understood that he had been left for dead among the dead. He lay still. He listened. In the distance he could hear voices. He could hear very faintly weeping. He could hear horses moving. He could hear someone, perhaps 100 paces off, singing softly in Arabic. After perhaps an hour he heard the voices come closer. Saracen soldiers walking among the bodies, looking for the living. He shut his eyes. He felt a boot turn him over. He felt a hand on his throat, checking for a pulse. He felt his eyes open against his will, and he saw above him the face of a young Saracen, perhaps his own age, with kind, dark eyes, and the young Saracen looked at his white surcoat and at the red cross on it, and the young Saracen called out to someone in the language Hugues did not speak. Hugues was dragged out of the hollow. He was carried over a man's shoulder for some distance. He was set down on the dust beside a long line of other men, perhaps 200 of them, all in the white of the temple or the black of the hospital, all wounded, all sitting or kneeling or lying in a long row in the late sun. Hugues understood that he had been recognized as a Templar. He understood that this was important in a way he did not understand, and that it was probably about to kill him. It was, but not in the way he expected. Saladin had given orders that the captured Templars and Hospitallers were to be executed. He had given this order because he considered the military orders to be the most dangerous of his enemies, fanatics, oath-bound to fight him to the death, who could not be ransomed because the orders forbade it, and who, if released, would come back into the field against him. He gave the order calmly and without anger. He walked among the kneeling prisoners himself, in the late afternoon, in his green cloak, with a small smile, and he chose the men who would die and the men who would live. The knights of the orders were to die. The other prisoners, the king, the secular nobles, the foot soldiers, were to be ransomed or sold. Hugues knelt in the long line. He saw Saladin pass in front of him. He saw Saladin's eye go to the red cross on his chest, and then to his face, and then move on. He understood that he had been chosen. The executions began. Saladin had his own people perform the executions, but he allowed any of his entourage who wished to do so to take part. Some of the religious scholars in his train asked for the privilege, because to kill an oath-bound enemy of Islam was a meritorious act. Saladin granted it. The scholars, who had probably never killed a man before in their lives, came forward with swords they did not know how to use, and they hacked at the kneeling prisoners with the inexperience of butchers and worse. Some of the prisoners died slowly. The others knelt in the line and waited their turn in silence and watched. Hugues knelt and watched. He watched the two men beside him in the line die. He watched the third. He watched the fourth. He prayed in a low voice the prayers that the order had taught him in the chapter house in Paris in the snow 19 months before. He commended his soul to God. He commended his sister Aline to God, and his mother, and the small chapel his grandfather had built. He waited. A Saracen soldier came at last to stand in front of him. The soldier was a young man. He had a sword in his hand. He looked tired. He looked, Hugues thought, almost as tired as Hugues felt. He raised the sword. He did not bring it down. A man on horseback rode up. He was an older Saracen in fine clothes, with a long grey beard and small sharp eyes, and he spoke very quickly and quietly to the young soldier, and he gestured at Hugues. The soldier hesitated. The older man spoke again, more sharply. The soldier lowered his sword. Hugues was lifted to his feet. He was led out of the line of kneeling prisoners. He was led, stumbling, his thigh wound bleeding through the linen bandage someone had put on it, perhaps 200 paces to the back of the encampment, where there was a small group of tents. He was put inside one of them. The flap was tied shut. He did not understand. It was 3 days before he understood. The older Saracen was a physician in the personal household of Saladin. He had served many years before, as a young man, in Antioch, and he had known there a Frankish knight, a Templar, in fact, who had been kind to him at a time when kindness from a Frank to a Saracen was uncommon. The Frankish Templar had been an older brother of Hugues's father. His name had been Aubrey of Champagne. He had died on a campaign in the south of the kingdom in 1163, 24 years before. The physician had recognized the device on Hugues's surcoat, a small private device that Hugues wore beneath the red cross, in honor of his uncle, whom he had never met but whose name was sacred in his family, and the physician had gone at once to ask the soldier to spare him. The physician came to Hugues in the tent on the third evening. He sat down on a low stool. He looked at Hugues for a long time without speaking. "Your uncle," the physician said at last in slow, careful French, "saved my life." Hugues did not know what to say. He had not known that his uncle had ever been in Antioch. He had never been told the story. "He was a good man," the physician said. "I am repaying a debt. You will not be killed. You will be ransomed back when I can arrange it. Until then you will stay here with me, and you will learn some Arabic, and you will not try to escape, because if you try to escape, my master's men will catch you, and they will not bring you back to me a second time. Do you understand?" Hugues understood. He stayed with the physician for 14 months. He learned a little Arabic. He learned a great deal of medicine. He came slowly, in the long, quiet evenings in the physician's tent, and later in the physician's house in Damascus, to know the older man as the closest thing to a father he had had since his own had died when he was 11. He grieved in those months for Geoffroy and Wilhelm and Pierre, and the 400 brothers of the temple who were lying in the dust below the horns of Hattin. He grieved for Jerusalem, which Saladin took on the 2nd of October 1187, without a fight, after a brief siege. The holy city which the First Crusade had taken in such blood was given up almost without resistance, because there was no one left to defend it. He grieved for the kingdom that he had come east to defend, and that had, in the space of 15 months from his arrival, ceased to exist. He was ransomed back in the autumn of 1188. The physician arranged it through intermediaries. The order paid a small sum. Templars were not supposed to be ransomed. But the order was in such disarray that the rule had been relaxed, and Hugues was put on a galley at the harbour of Acre, which had also fallen by then, and he was sent home. He came back to his mother's manor in Champagne in the spring of 1189. He came up the lane between the hawthorns on a brown horse that was not the brown horse he had ridden away on, and his sister Aline, who was 18 now, was the first person in the courtyard to see him. She did not at first recognize him. He had gone away a young man of 22, and he had come back a man of 25 who looked 40. His hair had gone grey at the temples. There was a long, thin scar down his right cheek that had not been there before. There was something behind his eyes when she looked into them that she did not know. She knew him at last. She ran to him. He got down from the horse and held her, and he could not speak, and after a long time he said only, "I came back." He told her that night in the kitchen by the fire the whole of his story. He told it slowly and without ornament. He told her about Geoffroy, and about Wilhelm, and about the quiet German prayers in the cell next to his at Acre. He told her about the long, thirsty march to Hattin. He told her about the kneeling line of prisoners in the late sun, and about the physician's tent, and about his uncle Aubrey, whom none of them had ever known had been a kind man. His mother, very old now, had come down from her room and was sitting in the corner with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened without speaking. When Hugues had finished, his mother got up and she came over to him, and she put her hands on either side of his face, and she said, "You came back. You came back to me." He stayed. He had been released from his Templar vows by a dispensation from the new master of the order on account of what he had suffered. He took over the running of the manor. He married late, a quiet local woman, and he had 3 children, 2 of whom lived. He never went east again. He never spoke of what he had seen, except that one night in the kitchen, to his sister and his mother. He died in the manor in the spring of 1233 of an illness that his physician could not name, at the age of 69. He was buried in the small chapel that his grandfather had built beside his father and his mother. His tomb is still there. It is in the floor of the side chapel, a flat slab of pale local stone, with a worn inscription in Latin that gives only his name and the dates of his birth and his death. Above the inscription, very faintly, almost rubbed away by the feet of 9 centuries of worshippers, is a small carving of a cross. It is not the red cross of the temple. It is a simple cross, of the kind that any Christian might have carved on any tomb. He had asked, on his deathbed, for the Templar device not to be carved on his stone. He had asked to be remembered only as a man who had loved his family and who had come home. The chapel is in a small village in Champagne. The village has changed its name twice in the centuries since. The manor house is gone, burned in a war in the 17th century, never rebuilt. The apple trees in the courtyard are gone. The road up from the village to where the manor used to be is now a dirt track that ends in a field. But the chapel is still there. And in the floor of the side chapel, the worn slab of pale stone is still there, and the worn inscription, and the small, simple cross. You can stand on the stone, in the cold, quiet afternoon light that comes in through the south window, and you can read the name if you know to look for it, and you can think about the long, terrible road that lies between a young man riding out of a French courtyard in the cold of a May morning, and an old man asking on his deathbed that no special mark be made of the order he had served, because all he wanted in the end was to be remembered as a man who had come home. Hugues, son of Renaud. He had ridden out for the holy places in the cold spring of 1186 at 22 years old. He had seen the kingdom fall. He had come back. It was enough.